Hey y'all, I'm Deborah. Welcome to my channel. If you've been here before, welcome back. I am starting something a little bit new. I'm starting the new series called Mystery and Manners, and that title comes from an essay written by Flannery O'Connor. I'm kind of expanding, broadening, taking a different direction with my channel, wanting to look more at, talk about books and it's kind of all sorts of things. Um, so I'm not leaving off the things that I've already been doing, the project panning. That's a lot of fun. But I'm going to be talking about, what I want to read, what I have read, and then hopefully once a month do a more in-depth into one of the books that I read during the previous month. So to start off, like I said, the Mystery and Manners comes from an essay by Flannery O'Connor, and she was writing about the importance of literature and the purpose of literature. And she said that basically her idea was that the purpose of literature is to give interpret mystery, the things that we don't know, in the light of manners, the things that we do know, not how to, which fork to choose, but the manner of living that we experience. So that's kind of where Mystery and Manners comes in. Okay, so this month I want to talk about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I read this in October. It was on my list of creepy reads. This is a very old copy. I bought this when my son was a baby, and he is now 30. And I had never actually read it, which is really, really sad. So I read this. It is fairly short. It was written by Mary Shelley. She's kind of best known as the author of Frankenstein, but also the wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet. And she was also the daughter of a very early feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft. She wrote the first kind of treatise on the rights of women called The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And her father was a political philosopher and novelist, but he had very liberal politics, especially for late 18th, early 19th century. So, her mother died when she was only a couple of weeks old, so she never actually knew her mother. She was raised by her father, whose political views bordered on anarchy, and kind of free love, open marriage kind of thing. Very, very scandalous, had a scandalous upbringing. And at the age of 16, she ran away with a married man who was Percy Shelley. They went to Lake Geneva, went to Europe, and lived together as man and wife, had a couple of kids, both of whom died. The first one was stillborn. The second one died very young, within a couple of months. So by the time she was 18, she had already experienced quite a lot of loss in her life. And she and her, quote, husband, unquote, they did eventually marry after his first wife committed suicide. Were having some terrible storms, and they were at Lake Geneva hanging out with Byron and his mistress and a couple of other people. And so they were sitting around at night with the firelight in the middle of the stormy season, and they decided it would be great to tell each other ghost stories, but they had to write one, and they would each take a turn. She struggled, but the story that she told, eventually she put into a novel, and that novel became what we have today as Frankenstein. She was 18 years old when she wrote this, 19 when it was published. And everybody thought that her husband was a ghostwriter on this, that he published it in her name, but it was actually him that wrote it. Nope, it was Mary Shelley all the way. She was using some of the conventions of the era. So when you look at the structure of this story, it is kind of a story within a story. It starts out kind of epistolary. So starts out as a series of letters between the captain of a ship who is an explorer and desperately wants to find the North Pole. And you start with this and you go, this has absolutely nothing to do with Frankenstein. Where is this going? But the book Frankenstein is very, very different from the Hollywood depictions of Frankenstein. The story is very different and has a lot more depth and a lot more layers in it than any of the Hollywood depictions of Frankenstein. So with this story, it's a story within a story. Starts as a series of letters, and the ship's captain rescues this forlorn, very sick, dying, near frozen person from the Arctic, an ice floe in the Arctic, and that person is Victor Frankenstein, the main character of the novel. In this story, then as Victor Frankenstein, as they bring him back to health, he begins to tell his story. So it's a story within a story, begins as a series of letters. And then Victor Frankenstein takes over his story. The conventional view of this story is that it's a story about who is the monster. Who is the real monster in this story? Is it this murderous creature that he created, or is it the creator that abandoned the creature? So in this story, Frankenstein is a very driven, ambitious scientist, and he is working to bring life to dead tissue. That part of the story is the same. What is different about this story is that this creature is not some mumbling, stumbling, unintelligible creature. He learns how to be. Frankenstein takes one look at him after he's alive and basically runs away, leaving this new life form to fend for itself and try to figure out best it can how to get through the world when everybody in the world sees him, sees how ugly he is, and wants to beat him with a stick. So that's not very helpful for building friendly character, building virtue. And that's another thing that's kind of underlying in this book is what is the role of hubris or loneliness in misery. So let me just flip my notes over here. There are some quotes that I want to share. And so the first quote is from the author of the letter, and he's actually writing about Victor Frankenstein. He says, "How can I see so noble a creature destroyed by misery without feeling the most poignant grief?" Which is pretty ironic considering how Frankenstein felt about his monster, his creature. I hesitate to call him the monster because who really is the monster in the story? The second quote I'd like to share is, "If one man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of the knowledge which I sought, for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race." This was also said by the sea captain, and it just kind of describes his ambition, his all-consuming ambition to get to the North Pole. And you're going to see, as you read the story, you're going to see some parallels between how Victor Frankenstein was working towards, how his ambition drove him to destruction, and how this sea captain also has to make some decisions about risking the life of his crew for his greatest desire. So Frankenstein's creature, I want to talk about him for just a minute. He is not this kind of mumbling, nonverbal thing that the movies would have us. He's very articulate. He learns speech by observing a family. And he learns to read by reading Plutarch's. Ended up with a copy of Plutarch's Lives, Paradise Lost, and another volume, I believe, of philosophy that I had never heard of. So when Frankenstein's creature speaks, it's very much more Elizabethan English. You get thys and thines, and it's a different form, more Shakespearean kind of English than the rest of the characters in a more modern kind of speech. He does suffer terribly from loneliness and being shunned by anyone and everyone that sees him, which they don't just run away, they really do try to chase him down and kill him. He does make an appeal to Frankenstein to make him a mate so that he would not be lonely. And I want to read to you the appeal that the creature makes in kind of explaining what's going on, because he has murdered. He's also like a 5-year-old child in some ways, behavioral. So in some ways, he's had no direction as to right or wrong, although he's got an inner sense of it. So at one point he says, "O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice, even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature, I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good, misery made me a fiend." That's definitely different, very different from the moaning, stumbling, staggering kind of creature that we have in our heads as the image of the creature. I won't give you too much of the rest of the story, but other events happen, and Frankenstein vows to track down his creature if it kills him, and eventually this tale ends with Frankenstein aboard the ship and the creature showing up to grieve Frankenstein before leaving to end his own life. And that's kind of where the book very abruptly ends at that point. You don't know if the creature actually did it or if he, you have no idea what really happened at the end. So this story, to me, it wasn't a scary story. It was a sad story. To me, the story wasn't so much about who the monster was, but what it is to be human and to be humane. In a lot of ways, the creature was more humane, had more humanity. He was definitely flawed, but in some ways he had more humanity than Frankenstein did. Frankenstein let someone else go to the gallows for a murder that the monster committed, because he didn't want to share his guilt and his part in making this creature. This creature initially had a capacity to love. He was very fond of the people that he was watching and learning language from. In fact, he would do kind things for them at night when no one would see him. But Frankenstein himself rejected his creature in a very definitive and based only on his appearance, without getting to know him or without getting to making any effort to counsel, to raise this child that he brought into this world. And there may have been a different outcome if he had had the courage to do what he needed to do. His ambition and his hubris led him to play God when he did not have the courage to deal with the ramifications of his decision, and to take responsibility for what he had brought into this world. So I think in some ways, yes, there are questions about, is Frankenstein the monster or is the creature the monster? They both do monstrous things. But I think another question in there is, who is the human? Who is humane? It seemed that the creature had a wider range of feeling, of guilt. Frankenstein has guilt, but it's a very self-centered guilt, if that makes any sense. So it really is a very good, there's a reason this story has endured for 200 years and why it is still a favorite of many people and why a lot of us pick it up and read it. I will definitely come back to this book again and again. It's a great story, a great tale, very readable, and it's not terribly long either. Okay. All right, so those are my thoughts about Frankenstein. Have you read it? What do you think of it? Do you plan on reading it now? Are you interested in it? Yeah, so that's my story about Frankenstein. I think next month I'm probably going to talk about The Scarlet Letter, because that one is another one that I have fallen in love with again as I'm reading through some of my collection. Okay, guys, I hope you have a good day. Let me know what you're reading, what you're doing, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.